Hi guys! I'm using Screencastify for the first time, so let's see how it goes. Yesterday, you guys read a little bit about Marco Polo. Today, we're going to continue on to talk about what does it mean to be a citizen in a global society by reading about a new character, Matthew Perry. And if you're thinking about it, I don't mean Matthew Perry from Friends, Matthew Perry in history. So, our goal today is to do similar to what you did yesterday, where you'll have a worksheet and it'll ask you for a little bit less today because we just want to focus on the main ideas of sections. And then you guys are going to go ahead and turn that in. So, let's start here with Perry opens the door to Japan. Make sure that your book is ready. As I read the paragraphs to you, annotate key details that are important in supporting the given main idea. Now, the given main idea is here. Japan had been isolated from foreigners for 200 years, but many nations, including the US, wanted to open trade with them. I'm going to give you one key detail as I read, but then you're going to have to find two more to support this main idea. And like we would do in class, I want you to ask yourself, what kind of evidence should I be looking for, right? So if I'm reading this main idea, one part of it relates to how Japan was isolated. So I would want to think about what does it mean to be in isolation, right? Think about it even right now. Some of us are in isolation where we're just not around too many people. So we don't have much communication or contact. So we might want to look for evidence that supports how they were isolated or shows why, maybe. And then another section shows how many nations, including the US, wanted to open trade with them. So if that's the main idea, I might ask myself, what key details would support that? Well, I would want to know why nations wanted to trade with them. And then I would want to know maybe which nations needed trade with them. So as I read, I'll give you one key detail, and your goal is to find me two more. Annotate while I read. Perry opens the door to Japan. On July 8, 1853, 4 black ships commanded by American Commodore Matthew Perry steamed into Tokyo Bay, Japan. The Japanese had never seen ships powered by steam, and they described the ships as giant dragons puffing smoke. It was a historic moment. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, a family of military leaders, Japan had allowed almost no foreign visitors for 200 years. By the mid-1800s, many Western nations were looking to Japan as a potential trading partner. They wanted to open new markets for their goods, and they wanted raw materials to support their rapidly growing industries. I'll pause there because I already noticed there's a little bit of information in just this paragraph and a half relating to why trade started with Japan and why they were isolated even. So look back if you have to underline a key detail or two. They wanted to open new markets for their goods, and they wanted raw materials to supply their rapidly growing industries. The US had its own reasons for wanting to establish contact with Japan. One reason was that American merchant ships were sailing to China to trade with the Chinese. After California became part of the United States, its ports on the Pacific Ocean became a convenient launching point for American ships sailing to Asia. The ships needed places to refuel and pick up supplies. Japan seemed like a good stopping point. Another reason the United States wanted to establish contact with Japan was that the American whaling fleet was operating in the North Pacific Ocean and generating big profits. The more U.S. whaling ships there were in the Pacific region, the more important it was for the fleet to have access to Japanese ports for supplies and safety. Okay. Now the last part here, finally, steamships replace sailing ships, etc. Make sure that you read on and go back now and find two more key details. The one I found so far would be that by the mid-1800s, many Western nations were looking to Japan as a potential trading partner. Here, it shows me that many nations wanted to open trade with Japan, right? That's a supporting detail. Find me two more that are related to this main idea and add them to your Google Doc. Okay. As we move forward, another key detail that might be helpful is that 4 black ships commanded by the American Commodore Matthew Perry steamed into Tokyo Bay, Japan. So they were isolated for a long time, for 200 years, and then all of a sudden, many people came over. Okay, so that might support this main idea. This sentence might support it. Find me two more. Pause now or go back later. I'll move on. Now, as I read this part, annotate two key details that are important in supporting this main idea. And I'm going to ask myself, what does this paragraph mostly talk about as I read? But at the same time, I'm going to read the main idea and see what key details could help me. Japan experienced difficult economic conditions in the 1850s, making Japan's policy of isolation vulnerable. So I would want to ask myself, which key details would support this best? Something related to difficult economic conditions, meaning maybe struggles financially for Japan, and then how they were vulnerable. Okay? So as I read, find me two key details. We're going to focus in on paragraph 4. Okay? By the 1850s, Japan was a nation in trouble. Its taxes were high, food was scarce, and many people were poor. At the same time, merchant families had become more powerful and they pressed the government to open Japan to trade. Since Japan had been isolated, it had not shared in any technological advances. It had no navy fleet or modern weapons, so the American ships, with their size and weapons, shocked and frightened the Japanese. Now, when we're thinking of somebody being vulnerable, that means we're kind of opening ourselves up to maybe some dangers. We're not in necessarily good safety. Maybe we don't feel strong, right? So, this paragraph mostly talks about how Japan is struggling with its economy. Find me two key details that support this main idea. Pause the video if you need to, otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and keep going, okay? All right, so now I've already given you these key details. Take a second to underline them in your book too. As we move on and talk about Matthew Perry, we're gonna go ahead and try to make up our own main idea based on a little bit of a word puzzle that I'm gonna give you, okay? So I'm gonna ask you to unscramble the main idea with these words. Each one can only be used once and focus in on the capitals, punctuation, commas, right, etc., to make the main idea. Now, the main idea starts with pressured by, so those have already been used for you. You're going to make that main idea on your Google Doc. So as I read, make sure you underline these key details because they're going to greatly help you to actually be able to write this main idea. Commodore Perry presented a letter from the American President Millard Fillmore to the Emperor of Japan. Then he sailed away, saying he would return for a reply with a much larger force. Here's an excerpt from President Fillmore's letter to the Emperor of Japan in 1852. I am desirous that our two countries should trade with each other, right? Desiring, wanting it, for the benefit both of Japan and the United States. Our steamships burn a great deal of coal. We wish that our steamships and other vessels would be allowed to stop in Japan and supply themselves with coal, provisions, and water. They will pay for them. These are the only objects for which I have sent Commodore Perry, with a powerful squadron, to pay a visit. Perry returned in early March of 1854 with 9 ships, over 100 guns, and a crew of close to 1,800. The Japanese felt they had to agree to the American demands. A treaty between the two nations was signed on March 31st, 1854. American ships would be allowed to stop for supplies and fuel in 2 of Japan's harbors. Some trade would also be allowed. Perry left Japan pleased with what he had done. His American interpreter wrote in his diary that a key was put into the lock and a beginning made to do away with the long seclusion of this nation. That's a great ending, right? A key being put into a lock, thinking about it as like a good new beginning, the start of something, right? So Japan finally is out of its own isolation and vulnerability and is making headway with a lot of nations, including the US. So you guys are going to use these 4 key details, and you're going to make a main idea, unscrambling these words, okay? You can pause now to do it before we move on to the last slide, or you can go back to this video. You decide, okay? So either pause or continue listening on. Last part is asking you to create one main idea. Okay? I'm going to read this section to you. Okay, and I want you to I want you to annotate these key details. We're going to use them to help us make a main idea for this section. And our goal in this section, if I look at the first sentence that says the Japanese, however, were furious, it already shows me that there's some feeling involved to how the United States responded to Japan, right? The fact that they had to forcefully ask them to sign a treaty. The Japanese were furious. So we're going to make a main idea that shows how maybe Japan's feelings changed over time. And that main idea will start like this. While Japanese people were angry at first, okay, and you'll fill in the blank. You're showing us a change over time, so you want to tell us, even though they were angry at the beginning, what was the result? What happened after? Okay? The Japanese, however, were furious. One Japanese nobleman expressed how many Japanese leaders felt about the new agreement. He described the Americans as arrogant and discourteous, and their actions as an outrage. Perry's visits and the signing of the treaty with Americans caused great changes in Japan. Other Western nations soon arrived demanding their own treaties. The new trade brought foreign money into the country, which upset the Japanese economy. The shoguns were pushed aside, and the emperor was restored as Japan's leader. Japan began to look beyond itself in order to learn from the rest of the world. Scholars were sent to Europe to learn Western technology. Cotton mills, paper mills, coal mines, and ironworks were built. Japan chose to modernize its economy while holding on to its culture, an approach called Japanese spirit, Western things. Today, Japan is America's main trade ally and one of the world's biggest economies. So even though they were angry at first, what result came about? Okay, how could we show how these feelings of anger changed over time into something new? You're going to annotate this in your book, okay? And then go to your Google Doc to make sure that you're filling in everything you have to and click turn in. If you have to rewatch this, feel free. Leave me feedback and let me know how this video went. All right, guys, good luck.